They offered him a job as their driver, and he accepted the card with a smile. 72 hours after he found out he owned the ground their entire empire was built on. A quiet man, a history teacher from Southeast DC. 12 years married into a family that never once saw him as an equal, a family of judges and senators and physicians who made clear in 100 small and not-so-small ways that he was tolerated at their table but never truly welcome at it. And then one Christmas evening, the patriarch of that family, a sitting judge who had spent over a decade treating this man like background furniture, slid a business card across his own mahogany dining room table and offered his son-in-law $38,000 a year to drive his cars. What that judge did not know, what no one at that table knew, was that 3 days earlier this quiet man had sat alone in a Birmingham law office and learned he had just inherited $3.1 trillion. And that the judge's greatest investment and the project he had spent 4 years building, the one he called his legacy, was sitting on land that now belonged to his driver. What happens when the man you spent 12 years underestimating has been holding the deed to your future the entire time? If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now. Stories like this one come out every week, and you do not want to miss what's coming. Drop a like if you're already feeling this one. And tell me, where in the world are you watching from today? Drop your city in the comments. We've got people tuning in from everywhere, and I want to know where you're joining us from. Now let me take you all the way back to where this story begins. To a Christmas dinner table in Prince George's County, Maryland, where a man sat quietly and said almost nothing, while the most expensive business card in the room sat face down on the mahogany, and nobody thought to turn it over. The Whitfield house smelled like it always did in December, candied yams and wood smoke, and Adrienne's expensive perfume cutting through everything else like a declaration. The Colonial on Sycamore Ridge Drive had 14 rooms, a circular driveway, and a kitchen that had been featured in a local home magazine 3 Christmases ago. Constance Whitfield, the judge's late wife, had picked every piece of furniture in that house herself, and the family had kept it exactly as she left it, which meant the dining room table seated 16 and was set with the good china every single holiday, without exception. Darnell Foster had been sitting at that table for 12 years. He arrived at 6:15, same as always, with a bottle of red wine he had chosen carefully and a sweet potato pie he had made himself from his mother Dorothy's recipe. He hung his own coat. Nobody offered. He found his place at the far end of the table. Not the children's end exactly, because there were no small children in the Whitfield family anymore, but the end farthest from the judge's chair at the head, which amounted to the same thing. Adrienne was already holding court when he walked into the dining room. She was telling a story about a bill she was shepherding through committee, her hands moving the way they did when she wanted the room to understand that what she was doing mattered. The 2 physicians, Marcus and his wife Celeste, were listening with the attentive expressions of people who consider themselves the audience for each other's stories. Keisha was in the kitchen finishing something. Nobody greeted Darnell when he appeared in the doorway. He set the pie on the sideboard, took his seat, and poured himself a glass of water. The judge entered the dining room at 6:30, and the energy in the room rearranged itself around him the way it always did, furniture-like, as if his presence had mass. Reginald Whitfield was 67 years old, straight-backed, silver-haired, and dressed in the kind of slacks that suggested he had never once in his adult life worn anything with an elastic waistband. He surveyed the table with the satisfaction of a man reviewing a courtroom he had already won. His eyes moved past Darnell without pausing. The meal proceeded the way Whitfield family meals always proceeded, in layers, each one designed to confirm what everyone already believed about each other. Adrienne talked about the legislature. Marcus talked about a new diagnostic protocol at his practice. The judge talked about the Largo project, as he had at every meal for the past 2 years. The way a man talks about something he has already decided will define him. Darnell ate his food and answered the questions directed at him, which were not many, and asked polite questions of his own, and refilled his water glass twice, and said nothing that was not specifically requested of him. Keisha sat 3 seats away and did not look at him very often. It was after the main plates were cleared, and before Darnell's sweet potato pie was served, that the judge cleared his throat and tapped the side of his water glass once with one finger. The table quieted with the efficiency of long practice. The judge explained that Whitfield Legacy Group had grown. He explained that the portfolio now included multiple active properties requiring regular client transport, site visits, and executive logistics. He explained that they needed someone reliable, someone who knew the roads, someone discreet and presentable who could be trusted with the family's professional image. He reached into the inside pocket of his blazer, produced a business card, and slid it with 2 fingers down the length of the table toward Darnell. $38,000 a year. Full benefits. Company uniform provided. Adrienne nodded as though this were reasonable. Marcus lifted his wine glass. Celeste smiled at the centerpiece. Keisha looked at her plate with the focused attention of a woman studying for an exam she had not prepared for. The table waited. Darnell looked at the card. He read it fully, both sides. He set it down in front of him. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his own jacket and removed a second card, heavier stock, cream-colored, with text embossed rather than printed, and placed it face down on the table beside his water glass without a word and without a change in expression. He said, "I appreciate that, sir." Nobody asked about his card. It sat there through dessert, through coffee, through Adrienne's second story about the legislature. It sat there while the judge accepted compliments on the pie that Darnell had made. It sat face down on the Whitfield mahogany, unremarkable, unexamined, the most valuable object in the room by a distance that would have made every person at that table unable to speak if they had known it. Darnell left at 9. He retrieved his coat himself. He said good night to everyone and meant it for no one in particular. In the car, he set both cards on the passenger seat. The judge's card face up, his own card face up beside it. Gerald Morrow, Morrow and Associates, Ellington Capital Partners, Birmingham, Alabama. He drove for 4 minutes before he picked up his phone. He called Morrow. Morrow picked up on the second ring, the way a man picks up when he has been expecting the call. Darnell kept his eyes on the road. He told Morrow what had happened at the table. Not with emotion, just the sequence. The announcement, the card, the $38,000, the uniform. He said it the way he said most things, which was flatly and completely without decoration. When he finished, there was a brief silence on the other end, and then Morrow said he understood and asked what Darnell wanted to do. Darnell told him he would call in the morning. He ended the call, pulled into the driveway of the house he shared with Keisha, and sat in the dark car for a long moment before going inside. But to understand what that phone call meant, you have to go back. You have to go back 12 years to a July cookout in Petworth on a Saturday afternoon when the music was coming from somebody's portable speaker and the smell of charcoal and seasoned chicken was in the air, and a woman named Keisha Whitfield was laughing at something her friend said, and Darnell Foster was standing near the cooler holding a cup of lemonade, and their eyes met across a folding table covered in foil pans, and something straightforward and true passed between them. He was 30 years old. She was 27. He taught 11th grade history at Anacostia High School and coached the junior varsity history bowl team and lived in a one-bedroom apartment on Alabama Avenue that he kept very clean. She was a communications coordinator at a non-profit in Columbia Heights and had an easy laugh and a way of listening that made you feel like what you were saying mattered. They talked for 2 hours at that cookout. They talked every night for 2 weeks after that. By October, they were inseparable in the way that feels permanent before you know what permanent costs. The first time he met her family, he wore his best shirt. The dinner was at the Colonial on Sycamore Ridge Drive, and the judge sat at the head of the table and looked Darnell over with the quiet, unhurried assessment of a man who was accustomed to evaluating people for a living and had already reached his verdict before the salad was served. He asked what Darnell did. Darnell told him. The judge nodded once, the way you nod when someone confirms something you already suspected, and then turned his attention to someone more interesting. That was the whole of their first real exchange. It established a template that the next 12 years would not deviate from significantly. What followed was not dramatic. That was the thing that was hardest to explain to anyone who hadn't lived it. There was no single explosion, no one terrible moment that split everything before and after. There was instead a slow and steady accumulation, like water damage, invisible until the ceiling caves. There was the Thanksgiving when the judge referred to Darnell's teaching as a good hobby, loudly, in front of 8 people, without any apparent awareness that it was an insult. There was the Christmas when Adrienne leaned across the table and asked Keisha in front of Darnell whether she had thought about what her long-term plan looked like, as if Darnell were a detour rather than a destination. There was the Easter Sunday when Marcus's wife Celeste steered Keisha into the kitchen for a private conversation, and Darnell sat at the dining room table with Marcus, and the 2 men said almost nothing to each other for 30 minutes. And it was the most honest interaction Darnell ever had with anyone in that family, because at least the silence didn't pretend. And there was Keisha, who loved him. He never doubted that. But love, he learned slowly, can coexist with a particular kind of cowardice. The cowardice of people who love the peace in a room more than they love the person being diminished in it. She never corrected them. Not once in 12 years did Keisha Whitfield Foster look across that mahogany table and say, "Enough." She changed subjects. She touched his arm under the table. She apologized for them later in private with real feeling, and then did the same thing the next holiday and the one after that. He did not hold it against her. That was simply who she was. He taught his classes. He coached his History Bowl team, which won the district title in 2019 and 2022, which nobody in the Whitfield family ever acknowledged. He took on one summer school session every year because the money helped and the kids needed it. He drove his 2011 Accord, which ran well because he maintained it carefully, and he did not apologize for it, and he tended to his mother. Dorothy Dupree Foster was a Southeast D.C. woman who had worked for the federal government for 31 years and retired with her dignity intact and her opinions undiminished. She was the person Darnell called when something troubled him. She was the one who listened without advice unless he asked for it. She died 18 months before that Christmas dinner in October of her 71st year, quietly and without prolonged suffering, in the house on Savannah Street where Darnell had grown up. The Whitfields sent flowers. A tasteful arrangement with a card signed by the judge. Darnell buried his mother, settled her affairs, and went back to work the following Monday, because that was what she would have expected of him. The prenuptial agreement had come earlier, in 2013. The judge had suggested it in the way he suggested most things, as a statement of fact delivered in the grammar of a question. He said that given the complexity of the Whitfield family's holdings, it was simply responsible planning. He said that their family attorney, Lawrence Osei, a man with an office in Bethesda and a reputation built on 3 decades of careful work for D.C. families with assets to protect, would handle everything. Darnell read the document. He signed it. He was 31 years old, and he was in love, and the Whitfields had already made clear that refusal was not a real option. Osei filed it, collected his fee, and went on about his business, satisfied that the document said exactly what the judge wanted it to say. What Osei did not know, when he drafted it, would later cost him everything professionally. But before we get to what Darnell did with that phone call, you need to understand what the Whitfields had built, because you cannot fully appreciate a fall until you understand the height. Whitfield Legacy Group had its offices on the 4th floor of a glass building in Greenbelt, Maryland, in a suite that the judge had furnished himself. Dark wood, framed commendations, a conference table that seated 12 and was never used for anything that required 12 people. The judge was chairman. Marcus was operations director, a title that meant he ran the day-to-day, while his father ran the image, which was the division of labor that suited both of them perfectly. The portfolio, as of the fall of 2024, was valued at $340 million across 14 commercial properties in Prince George's and Montgomery counties. Office parks, a medical building, 2 strip centers, and a handful of mixed-use parcels that had appreciated quietly for years while the judge took the credit in every room he entered. The judge talked about Whitfield Legacy Group the way some men talk about their children, with a pride that had long since crossed the line into something more like ownership. He had built it, he said, from nothing, which was not entirely accurate, since his starting capital had come from a settlement his late wife Constance received from a slip-and-fall claim in 1997. But the judge had a gift for editing history into a more flattering shape, and by the time he told the story at a dinner party, Constance's settlement had become his vision, his instinct, his decade of sacrifice. Marcus had inherited his father's gift for that kind of selective memory. The Largo project was different from everything else in the portfolio. It was not an acquisition or a renovation. It was a construction project. A $220 million mixed-use development on a 12-acre parcel in Largo, Maryland, 4 years in the making, with 9 private investors who had put in a combined $47 million in committed capital based on projections the judge had presented with the authority of a man who sat on a bench for a living. The plan was a 9-story building with ground-floor retail, 4 floors of Class A office space, and 4 floors of residential units above. The judge had a rendering of it framed and hanging in his office. He pointed to it during meetings the way a man points to a photograph of a son who went to a good school. He had solicited his investors with precision. 3 of them were Adrian's campaign donors, men who wrote checks for Access and understood that Access had multiple forms. 2 were fellow judges, sitting on adjacent benches, men who trusted Reginald Whitfield the way you trust someone who has watched you work for 20 years. The remaining 4 were prominent D.C. area businessmen, a contractor, a commercial banker, a developer from Silver Spring, and a man who had made his money in telecommunications and was looking for somewhere dignified to park it. The judge had assembled this group over the course of 14 months, 1 private dinner at a time. What made the Largo project structurally different from everything else in the portfolio was the land. Whitfield Legacy Group did not own the 12-acre parcel outright. They held a long-term ground lease from a Maryland limited liability company called Meridian Land Partners, an entity that had been quietly collecting its annual lease payment, $460,000 per year. For the 11 years the judge had been developing the site. In the early years, when the parcel was just a cleared lot with potential, the arrangement had seemed reasonable. A ground lease was not unusual in commercial real estate. The judge had used them before, and Meridian Land Partners, as far as his attorneys could determine, was a sleepy holding company with no active principal, a registered agent in Birmingham, and no apparent interest in the property beyond collecting its annual payment on schedule. For 3 months, the judge's broker had been attempting to reach someone at Meridian Land Partners to negotiate a lease extension. The current lease ran through 2027. The Largo project's financing required a minimum of 30 years of ground lease security to satisfy the construction lender's requirements. Without the extension, First Meridian Capital, to the lender holding the $280 million construction loan commitment, would not release the funds. And without the funds, the project could not proceed to closing. 3 months of calls, 3 months of letters forwarded to a registered agent address and met with silence. The judge was annoyed in the way powerful men get annoyed when something small refuses to bend, not worried, not alarmed, just irritated at the inefficiency of it. He told his broker that it was a bureaucratic delay. He told his investors it was a routine matter being resolved. He told Marcus to keep the site foreman on schedule and not to communicate any uncertainty to the subcontractors. One Sunday evening in November, Keisha mentioned it at dinner. She said her father seemed stressed about some land company that wasn't responding to his people. She said it almost casually, the way you mention weather. Darnell looked up from his plate. He said, He took a bite of his food. He said nothing else. A week later, the judge called his broker and told him to send one final written request to Meridian Land Partners, formal, direct, and unambiguous. He expected a response within 30 days. He would get one. The certified letter arrived on a Thursday in early December, 6 weeks after Dorothy's estate had been formally settled, and Darnell had signed the last of the paperwork. It came to his school address, which he had listed as his primary contact during the estate proceedings, and his department secretary left it on his desk between second and third period. It was a thick envelope, cream-colored, with a return address in Birmingham, Alabama, and the name Morrow and Associates, printed in clean serif type in the upper left corner. He picked it up, turned it over once, and put it in his bag. He finished the school day. He drove home. He made himself a plate of leftover rice and chicken from the night before, sat at his kitchen table, and opened it. The letter was 3 pages. It asked him to come to Birmingham at his earliest convenience to discuss a matter of significant legal and financial importance related to the estate of Cornelius James Ellington, deceased. It said that Morrow and Associates had been the primary counsel for the Ellington estate for 31 years, and that recent developments required the direct involvement of the sole identified heir. It said that all travel expenses would be covered. It gave a phone number and a name. Gerald Morrow, senior partner. Darnell read it twice. Then he called the number. He drove to Birmingham 3 days later, on a Wednesday, leaving before dawn in the 2011 Accord, with a travel mug of coffee and the radio set to a gospel station out of College Park that his mother had liked. He arrived at the offices of Morrow and Associates at 10 in the morning. The suite was on the 7th floor of a downtown building, quietly furnished, the kind of office that communicated competence through its very restraint. No excess, no performance, just dark carpet and good lighting and shelves of files that had clearly been used. Gerald Morrow met him at the door himself. He was 61 years old, trim and deliberate, with reading glasses on a chain around his neck, and the careful handshake of a man who understood that first impressions were data. He offered Darnell coffee, which Darnell accepted. He said he appreciated Darnell making the drive. Then he sat down across from him and opened a folder and began to speak with the unhurried precision of a man who had delivered complicated news enough times to know that clarity was the only real kindness. He started with Cornelius Ellington. Cornelius was Darnell's great-uncle on his mother Dorothy's side, the younger brother of Dorothy's father, Clement Dupree, who had married into the Ellington name. The family fracture had happened in 1987, Morrow explained, over a disputed inheritance when Clement died. Cornelius and Dorothy's branch of the family had not spoken in decades. Cornelius had never married, had no children, and had spent 4 decades assembling a private industrial empire with the quiet persistence of a man who had no one to answer to, and no deadline but his own mortality. 4 holding companies. Mineral rights across Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, Mississippi, Florida, South Carolina, and Maryland. Infrastructure contracts. Commercial ground leases throughout the Mid-Atlantic region. And 1 trust amendment, filed in 2019, 2 years before Cornelius died, that quietly named Dorothy Dupree Foster as his primary heir and Darnell Foster as the contingent heir in the event of Dorothy's prior death. Dorothy had died first. Morrow slid the trust documents across the desk. He let Darnell read them without interruption. Then he said, plainly and without theatre, the total combined value of the Ellington estate, as assessed across all 4 holding companies and their subsidiary assets, was $3.1 trillion. Darnell set the papers down. He picked up his coffee cup. He took a sip. He set it down. He did not say anything for almost a full minute. Morrow waited. He had seen this before. Not this number, not in 31 years, but the silence that follows a number a person cannot yet hold. He did not rush it. Then Morrow opened a second folder. He said there were several active lease files he wanted to walk Darnell through, beginning with the Mid-Atlantic portfolio. He produced a set of lease documents organized by property and lessee. He explained the structure. Ellington Capital Partners was the parent entity. Meridian Land Partners was one of its Maryland holding subsidiaries, and Meridian held ground leases on several commercial parcels in Prince George's and Montgomery counties. He slid the Meridian file across the desk. Darnell looked at the top document. It was a lease summary for a 12-acre parcel in Largo, Maryland. Commercial development project, mixed use. Lessee of record, Whitfield Legacy Group. He read the name. He read it again. His expression did not change, not a flicker, not a tightening around the eyes, nothing. He simply absorbed it the way a still pond absorbs a stone, completely without protest, closing over it like the thing had always been there. Morrow, who had been watching, noted the stillness and said nothing. After a moment, Darnell asked how long he had to decide how he wanted to proceed. Morrow said there was no legal deadline. The estate was his. The decisions were his. He could take whatever time he needed. Darnell nodded. He said he needed 72 hours. He drove back to D.C. the same afternoon. He let himself into the house, hung his coat, sat on the couch in the living room, and did not turn on the television. He sat with it. All of it. The number, the name on the lease file, 12 years of Christmas dinners, $38,000 and a company uniform. He did not call anyone. He did not tell Keisha. 72 hours later, he was seated at the judge's mahogany table, watching a business card slide toward him across the wood, and saying with perfect stillness, "I appreciate that, sir." The Christmas lights on the houses along Sycamore Ridge Drive blurred past the windows as Darnell turned onto the main road and pointed the Accord south toward home. The judge's business card was on the passenger seat. His own card was beside it. He drove for 4 minutes without touching his phone. Then he called Morrow. Morrow answered on the second ring. Darnell told him what had happened at the table. Not the emotional weight of it, just the facts. The announcement, the card, $38,000 a year, a uniform. He delivered it the way he delivered most important information, which was without decoration and without pause. When he finished, the line was quiet for a moment. Then Darnell told Morrow what he wanted to do. He wanted to decline the Meridian Land Partners lease extension, formally, in writing, by certified mail. He did not want a reason given, no negotiation, no counteroffer, no explanation of any kind. The letter would simply state that Ellington Capital Partners, on behalf of Meridian Land Partners, had elected not to extend the ground lease, effective immediately, with reversion of the land in 60 days per the terms of the existing agreement. That was all. Morrow said he understood. He confirmed what Darnell already knew from the Birmingham meeting, that Meridian was a wholly owned subsidiary of Ellington Capital Partners, that the ground lease contained no obligation to renew, and that a decline was clean and legally final. No external party had any recourse. The land was Ellington's. The decision was Darnell's. The paperwork would take less than a day to prepare. Darnell said good. He had one more instruction. He wanted a complete information blackout on his connection to Ellington Capital until he personally authorized a disclosure. No press, no broker inquiries answered, no corporate records made accessible beyond what was already public. Any party attempting to identify the principles of Ellington Capital Partners was to be routed through corporate counsel only, and corporate counsel was to say nothing except that all matters were being handled by the estate's legal representative. Darnell's name was not to appear anywhere. Morrow said that was already standard practice for the estate. Cornelius had operated that way for 4 decades. The infrastructure for privacy was already built. Darnell said he appreciated that. Then Morrow noted something Darnell had already calculated himself. The Largo project's closing window was 60 days. If the decline letter went out in January, the math was precise and brutal. The project would lose its land with no time remaining to find a replacement parcel, satisfy the lender's security requirements, and still close. It would not stall, it would not pause and recover. It would collapse completely at the finish line after 4 years of the judge's work and 9 investors' money. Darnell said he understood. Morrow asked if he was certain. Darnell said he was. There was a brief silence, the kind that passes between 2 professionals when a decision of consequence has just been made, and both of them know it. Then Darnell said there was one more thing. He wanted Morrow to pull the prenuptial agreement filed by Lawrence Osei in 2013 and have a Maryland family law specialist review every clause, with particular attention to any asset disclosure requirements. He said he had reason to believe the document had a structural defect, and he wanted to know exactly what it was before he needed to use that information. Morrow said he would have a preliminary answer within a week. Darnell said that was fine. He thanked Morrow. He ended the call. The highway opened up ahead of him, the nighttime traffic thin, the city glowing in the distance the way it always did, indifferent and permanent, lit up for no one in particular. He drove without the radio. He did not replay the dinner in his mind. He did not catalogue every slight or rehearse what he wished he had said years ago. That was not who he was, and it had never been who he was. He simply drove, and the plan settled around him like something that had always been waiting to be named. He pulled into the driveway at 9:47. He sat in the car for a moment, the engine off, the neighborhood quiet around him. A string of holiday lights blinked on a neighbor's porch. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked once and went silent. He picked both cards up from the passenger seat and put them in his jacket pocket. He went inside. The house was dark except for the lamp in the bedroom. He could hear Keisha's breathing from the doorway, slow and even. She was already asleep. He hung his jacket carefully. He went to the kitchen, drank a glass of water standing at the sink, and rinsed the glass. He looked out the kitchen window at the backyard, which was dark and still, and then he went to bed. He slept without difficulty. In Birmingham, 3 hours behind the night, Gerald Morrow sat at his desk and began drafting the certified letter that would be sent to Whitfield Legacy Group's registered address in the 2nd week of January. He worked with the same unhurried precision he brought to everything. By midnight, the letter was complete. By morning, it would be in the queue to go out. The judge's greatest project had 60 days left to live, and it did not know it yet. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in the second week of January, tucked between a vendor invoice and a property tax notice in the morning. Delivery to the Whitfield Legacy Group offices in Greenbelt. Marcus opened it. He read it once, then he read it again. Then he walked down the hall to his father's office without knocking, which was something he almost never did, and set it on the judge's desk without a word. The judge read it standing up. Ellington Capital Partners, acting on behalf of its wholly owned subsidiary Meridian Land Partners, hereby provided formal notice that the ground lease for the Largo, Maryland parcel would not be renewed upon its current terms. The land would revert to Meridian Land Partners in 60 days per the existing agreement. All further inquiries were to be directed to corporate counsel. There was a name and a phone number at the bottom. The letter was 2 paragraphs long. The judge set it down. He said it was a negotiating tactic. He said some property management entity was trying to squeeze a better rate out of them at the last minute, and that his attorneys would handle it by end of week. He picked up his phone and called his broker. His broker, a man named Terence Gill, who had worked with the judge for 11 years without a single significant problem, said he had never heard of Ellington Capital Partners. He said he had tried to find contact information beyond the registered agent address in Birmingham and had come up against a wall of holding companies with no accessible principals, no website, and no industry presence he could locate. He said it did not look like a firm that operated publicly, which meant it was either very new or very old, and he was not sure which was more concerning. The judge told him to keep looking. His attorneys came back 3 days later with the same answer. Ellington Capital Partners was a private holding entity registered in Alabama, operating through a registered agent at a Birmingham law office, with no individual names publicly attached to its ownership structure. Its subsidiaries, including Meridian Land Partners, were similarly structured. There was no pressure point. There was no person to call. There was nothing to grab onto. The judge called first Meridian Capital. That call did not go well. The lender's asset management team had already received notification of the lease decline through their own channels. They said they were flagging the $280 million construction loan commitment for immediate review. They said that without secured ground lease coverage extending at least 30 years beyond the project's completion date, the loan could not be released under its current terms. They said they would be in touch. The judge organized a private dinner. He called all 9 investors and asked them to come to his home on a Friday evening. He told them there had been a procedural complication with the ground lease that his team was actively resolving and that there was no cause for alarm. 6 of the 9 came. 3 sent their regrets. 2 of the 3 who declined sent their attorneys instead, with written questions that arrived by email before the dinner even started. At the dinner, the judge was composed. He used words like routine and temporary and manageable. He said that in 30 years of commercial real estate, every significant project encountered friction, and that what distinguished serious developers from amateurs was how they handled it. He spoke with the authority of a man who had spent decades being believed. 2 of the 6 who came did not look convinced. Meanwhile, out in Largo, the site foreman called Marcus on a Wednesday afternoon. He said the steel subcontractor had paused his next delivery pending written confirmation of financing status. He said the electrical crew was asking questions he did not have answers to. He said word traveled fast on job sites, and the word was that the land situation was not resolved. Marcus told him everything was fine. Marcus did not believe that. On a Friday morning, the judge called Terence Gill again to ask if there had been any progress identifying the principals of Ellington Capital. Terence said there had not. The judge told him that was unacceptable. He said he had spent 4 years on this project, had 9 investors counting on him, had a $280 million loan sitting ready to close, and that some faceless holding company in Alabama was not going to dismantle it with a 2-paragraph letter. He said it loudly. He said it with a coldness in his voice that Terence Gill had never heard in 11 years. It was the first time the judge had ever raised his voice at him. Terence said he would keep trying. The following Sunday, the Whitfield family gathered for dinner, as they did most Sundays. The judge sat at the head of the table. Marcus sat to his left. Keisha was there. The food was pot roast and rice, and Adrian had brought a sweet potato pie from the bakery near her office. It looked and felt exactly like every other Sunday dinner. Darnell reached across the table, picked up the serving spoon, and filled his plate with sweet potatoes. Then he looked up pleasantly and asked the judge how the Largo project was coming along. The table went briefly still. The judge looked at Darnell. He looked at him for just a moment too long. Then he said the word, "fine." He said it the way a man says a word he is no longer sure he believes. Darnell nodded and went back to his food. The judge said nothing else for the rest of the meal. But the word "fine" had cost him something, and somewhere beneath the composure, below the silk tie and the straight back, and the 28 years of judicial authority, the judge felt, for the first time, the particular cold sensation of a floor that might not hold. He did not know yet that it had already given way. February arrived, and the dominoes did not fall one at a time. They fell all at once. First, Meridian Capital called the loan. The letter arrived at Whitfield Legacy Group on a Monday morning. The $280 million construction loan commitment was being recalled. The collateral, the Largo project, was deemed insufficiently secured given the unresolved ground lease status. Whitfield Legacy Group had 30 days to cure the deficiency, or the commitment would be formally withdrawn. 30 days. 4 years of work. 30 days. Marcus read it and did not move for a full minute. 2 days later, the civil suits were filed. 2 of the 9 investors, a telecommunications businessman named Harold Petty and a Silver Spring developer named Clifton Barnes, filed complaints in Prince George's County Circuit Court alleging fraud and misrepresentation. The complaints stated that Judge Whitfield had solicited their investment capital while representing the ground lease situation as resolved, when in fact it had been in dispute for months. The complaints were public record the moment they were filed. A courthouse reporter had them by noon. By the following morning, a brief item appeared in the Maryland section of a regional business publication. It named the judge. It named the project. It named the amount. The Maryland State Bar moved within 72 hours. A preliminary inquiry was opened into whether Judge Reginald Whitfield's dual role as a sitting circuit court judge and private investment project sponsor created an undisclosed conflict of interest in his solicitation of investor capital. The bar's inquiry notice was sent to the judge's chambers. His clerk received it on a Wednesday. The judge was placed on administrative leave from the bench pending the outcome of the inquiry. 28 years, gone from the bench in a letter. The inquiry notice became public record the same day. By Thursday, 2 reporters had called the courthouse. By Friday, the story had moved from the business section to the metro section. Adrian's phone rang 3 times on the same Thursday morning. 3 calls, 3 donors, 3 men whose campaign contributions had helped fund 2 of her Senate campaigns, 3 men who had also invested in the Largo project at the judge's invitation and were now watching their committed capital dissolve. They did not threaten. They did not need to. The silence in their voices communicated everything that threats would have said more loudly. By afternoon, Adrian's office released a statement. It was 4 sentences long. It said that Senator Whitfield Coates believed in transparency and accountability. It said she was stepping back from all family business matters to focus on her legislative responsibilities. It did not mention her brother by name. It did not need to. The political press read it in under an hour. One columnist wrote that the statement was the political equivalent of leaving a burning building while pretending to go for a walk. The story was picked up by 2 additional outlets by sundown. Marcus called Ellington Capital Partners' registered agent on a Friday afternoon. He was routed to corporate counsel within 20 minutes. He asked to speak with someone with authority over the Meridian Land Partners lease decision. The attorney on the line said all matters related to Ellington Capital Partners were being handled by the estate's legal representative, Gerald Morrow of Morrow and Associates in Birmingham, and that no further information could be provided. He was given a phone number. It was the same number Darnell had called from his driveway on Christmas night. Marcus did not know that. The Washington Post ran the profile on a Tuesday. The Maryland desk had been working it for 3 weeks. The piece was titled "Who Owns Ellington Capital Partners?" and it traced the holding company structure methodically from its Birmingham registration through its Maryland subsidiaries to the recent trust transfer that had placed controlling interest in the hands of a single private heir. The reporter had found Darnell through the estate's probate filing. His name was in the 3rd paragraph. His occupation, high school history teacher, Anacostia High School, Southeast D.C., was in the 4th. His photograph, pulled from the school's faculty directory, appeared at the top of the article. Keisha saw it on her phone at 10:47 in the morning. She was sitting in her car in the parking lot of a grocery store in Bowie. She read the article twice. She called Darnell's cell phone. He was in 2nd period. He did not answer. She called the school's main line. The secretary said he was in class. She drove home. That evening Darnell came home to find her sitting at the kitchen table with her phone on the table in front of her and the article still on the screen. He sat down across from her. She asked him if it was true. He said yes. She asked him how long he had known. He told her since Birmingham, since the certified letter, since 3 days before Christmas dinner. She was quiet for a long time. Then she asked why he had not told her. He said he needed to know something first, and that the Christmas dinner had told him what he needed to know. She did not ask what he meant. She already understood. That was perhaps the most devastating part. She already understood exactly what he meant. Within a week, she had filed for separation. Osei's prenuptial agreement was reviewed by a Maryland family law specialist retained by Morrow's office. The specialist identified a fatally defective asset disclosure clause. Under Maryland family law, the defect voided the agreement's protective provisions entirely. Keisha was entitled to nothing from the Ellington estate, not $1 of $3.1 trillion. Osei received a formal malpractice notice on a Thursday afternoon. He read it 3 times before he called his own attorney. That same evening, Darnell's cell phone buzzed on the kitchen counter where he was eating dinner alone. He looked at the screen. It was Judge Reginald Whitfield, calling his personal cell phone for the first time in 12 years of knowing him. Darnell looked at the name on the screen. He watched it ring. He did not move. He let it go to voicemail, and the judge, who had never in his life left a message for Darnell Foster, did not leave one now. Darnell set the phone face down on the counter. He finished his dinner. He did not call ahead. On a Saturday morning in late March, Darnell Foster drove to the Whitfield Colonial on Sycamore Ridge Drive for the last time. Gerald Morrow sat in the passenger seat, a document folder on his lap, saying nothing. They had spoken about what would happen this morning. There was nothing left to discuss. Darnell had chosen this house deliberately, not a law office, not a neutral location. This house, these rooms, this table. He wanted the judge to feel the full weight of where they were sitting when it happened. The judge answered the door himself. He looked older than he had at Christmas. The administrative leave had done something to him, taken some essential pressure out of his posture, left him slightly diminished, like a tire that had lost air slowly over weeks. He looked at Darnell. He looked at Morrow. He looked at the folder under Morrow's arm. He let them in without a word. Marcus was in the living room. He stood when they entered, which was something he never did when Darnell arrived at the house. Adrian was not there. She had not been to the house in 6 weeks. Darnell said he would like to sit at the dining room table. The judge led them there. They sat. The judge at the head, from habit, from 12 years of unthinking habit. And Marcus to his left, and Darnell and Morrow across from them. Morrow set the document folder on the table and folded his hands on top of it. He did not open it. He did not speak. He simply sat with the stillness of a man who understood that this moment belonged entirely to someone else. Darnell looked at the judge for a long moment. Then he began to speak, not loudly, not with anger, with the quiet, unhurried clarity of a man who had been preparing for this conversation for 12 years without knowing it. He said, "I want to walk you through something. I am going to take my time, and I would ask you to listen." He started with the first Christmas dinner. He named the year. He described the seating. He described the way the judge's eyes had moved past him at that first introduction as if he were furniture. He said he had noticed it then and had decided even then that he would not let it change who he was. He named specific holidays, specific comments, the hobby remark, Adrienne's question about his long-term plan, Celeste steering Keisha into another room. He named them without heat, the way a historian names dates, because they were facts, and facts did not require emotion to be devastating. The judge's jaw tightened. Darnell kept going. He described the Christmas dinner 3 months ago. He described arriving at the table already knowing what he knew. He described watching the judge reach into his jacket. He described the card sliding across the mahogany, $38,000, a company uniform. He said it plainly. He said he had picked up that card and read it and thanked the judge for his generosity, and then he had reached into his own jacket. He paused there. He said, "Do you remember the card I placed on this table that evening? The one I set face down right here next to my water glass?" The judge said nothing. Darnell said, "No one asked about it. It sat there through dessert, through coffee. I picked it up when I left." He told them about Birmingham. He told them about the certified letter. He told them about driving down before dawn with the gospel station on the radio and sitting across from Gerald Morrow in that quiet 7th-floor office and listening while the scope of what his great-uncle Cornelius had built over 4 decades was laid out in front of him. 4 holding companies, 7 states, $3.1 trillion in combined assets. Marcus made a sound. Darnell did not look at him. He said, "Morrow showed me the lease files, the Mid-Atlantic portfolio." He put the Meridian Land Partners file on the desk, and I looked at the top document. And right there, in the lessee field, I saw the name Whitfield Legacy Group. And I want you to understand, I did not react, because at that moment I did not yet know what I was going to do. I took 72 hours. I thought about it, and then your father slid a driver's card across this table, and I knew. He looked directly at the judge. He said, "You offered me $38,000 a year to drive your cars. 72 hours after I found out I owned the ground your biggest investment was standing on. I sat at your table, Judge. I ate your food, and I never said a word because I wanted you to show me exactly who you were first." The silence that followed was complete. The judge's face moved through several things in rapid succession. Shock, then calculation, then something that cracked around the edges and might have been shame if shame had ever been a familiar emotion to him. He said, "Darnell, there are things we can discuss. There are arrangements that could be." His voice broke slightly on the last word, and he stopped. Morrow closed the folder. That was his only contribution to the conversation. He simply closed it. The judge looked at the folder. He looked at Morrow. He looked at Darnell. Marcus stared at the surface of the mahogany table and did not speak. He had not said a single word. Darnell stood. He buttoned his jacket one button the way his mother had taught him to before he walked out of any room that mattered. He looked at the judge one final time. He said, "I didn't come here to negotiate. I came here so you'd know it was me." He and Morrow walked to the front door. Darnell opened it himself. He did not look back. On the mahogany table, where his water glass had sat at every Christmas dinner for 12 years, he had left the Morrow and Associates card, face up this time, Gerald Morrow's name, and the words Ellington Capital Partners visible and unambiguous in the morning light. 3 weeks later, the judge's attorneys called Morrow's office to discuss settlement terms. The settlement negotiations took 11 days. Morrow handled them without drama and without mercy. The judge's attorneys came to the table with offers that shrank each time Morrow declined them, until the final terms were reached and signed and the matter was formally closed. Darnell was not present for any of it. He had already said everything he needed to say at that table on a Saturday morning in March. What came after happened in stages, the way ruin always does, not in one catastrophic moment, but in a sequence of quiet, permanent closings. The Maryland State Bar concluded its inquiry in May. The formal censure was issued on a Thursday. Judge Reginald Whitfield was removed from the bench, his 28 years of service rendered, in the bar's language, inconsistent with the standards of judicial conduct. The framed commendations in his Greenbelt office were taken down by his own hand before the building management changed the lock on the suite. His personal assets were partially liquidated to satisfy the civil judgments filed by Harold Petty and Clifton Barnes. The Largo project was formally dissolved. The parcel reverted to Meridian Land Partners, as the letter had always said it would. The judge retired to the Colonial on Sycamore Ridge Drive and was not seen much after that. Whitfield Legacy Group filed for Chapter 11 protection in June. Marcus signed the paperwork himself, the operations director of a company in the process of ceasing to operate. He found a position the following month as a mid-level property manager for a commercial real estate firm in Rockville, a salaried role, the first he had held in 15 years. He did not announce it on social media. There was nothing to announce. Adrienne lost her 2 remaining major donors by the end of April. A primary challenge was announced in July. A younger candidate, a woman from Prince George's County, who had no relationship with the Whitfield name and no reason to carry its weight. The political analysts who covered the district said Adrienne's path to a 4th term had become, in their careful phrasing, structurally difficult. Adrienne did not comment publicly. Lawrence Osei settled the malpractice claim quietly through his professional liability insurer in the last week of May. The terms were confidential. His reputation in D.C. family law circles was not. Word traveled the way it always does among attorneys, not as announcement but as inference, in the slight pause before a referral is made, in the name that is no longer mentioned first. Keisha's separation was finalized in the spring. She received nothing from the Ellington estate. The prenuptial agreement's defect had sealed that completely. She moved back to her own apartment in Bowie, reconnected with friends she had let drift during the marriage, and began, slowly, to build a life that was entirely her own. Darnell held no anger toward her. He simply held no contact either. Some things end without an enemy, and this was one of them. Darnell finished the school year. He taught his classes, coached the History Bowl team through a 3rd district title, and said nothing to his colleagues about any of it beyond what was in the newspaper. His students did not know, the faculty did not press. He was, to Anacostia High School, exactly what he had always been. The history teacher who arrived early and stayed late and knew how to make the past feel like something that mattered. In June, with Morrow's assistance, he established the Dorothy Dupree Ellington Foundation. The foundation's first initiative funded 40 full college scholarships annually for graduating seniors from Prince George's County public schools, need-based, renewable, no strings. The announcement was made through a brief press release that listed the foundation's mission and named it for his mother. Darnell did not give interviews. Ellington Capital Partners retained Morrow and Associates as its permanent legal counsel. Darnell moved to a 3-bedroom house in Bulwer, modest, brick, with a backyard and a short commute, and continued to drive the 2011 Accord, which still ran well because he still maintained it carefully. He met Sandra in September. A colleague introduced them at a back-to-school gathering at a community center on Mississippi Avenue. She was a school librarian, easy in her own skin, with the particular warmth of a person who has spent her career in rooms where quiet is treated as a gift rather than an absence. They talked for a long time that evening about books, about which periods of history were hardest to teach honestly, about what it meant to give young people access to a story that included them. She did not ask about Ellington Capital Partners. She did not know to ask. She asked about his students. He found that he wanted to answer. Now here is what I want you to take away from Darnell Foster's story. There are people in your life who have decided what you are worth based on what they can see. They look at your car, your job, your address, and they calculate a number, and they treat you according to that number consistently across years without ever pausing to ask what they might be missing. Darnell never argued with their calculation. He never defended himself. He never demanded to be seen differently. He simply went on being who he was, doing the work he was called to do, carrying his grief quietly and his dignity completely. And when the moment came, he did not rush. He waited 72 hours. He sat at the table. He said, "Thank you. Patience is not weakness. Silence is not surrender. And what belongs to you, truly belongs to you, has a way of finding you no matter how long it takes or how many people failed to see it coming. Now I want to hear from you. What would you have done in Darnell's position?" When that driver's card slid across the table, 72 hours after Birmingham, would you have kept quiet like he did? Or would you have said something right there at that Christmas dinner? Drop your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know. If this story moved you at all, please take 2 seconds and hit that like button. It helps this channel more than you know, and it helps stories like this one find the people who need to hear them. I will see you in the next one. On the first day of the new school year, Darnell Foster stood at the whiteboard in his classroom at Anacostia High School and wrote the date in the upper left corner the way he always did. 23 new faces looked up at him from 23 desks. They knew his name from the course catalogue. They knew he had won the district title 3 times. They knew nothing else. He turned from the board, looked at them and said, "Let's begin."